The word autism, what would you define a classical kid with autism? If someone said to you, what is autism? What would you say to them?
Well, basically autism is sort of, it has these three core symptoms. There's always going to be deficits in speech and language and communication. Some kids are nonverbal, but other kids are verbal, but either one of the kids will use their language communicatively in the beginning. The second area that is always affected is in social abilities. So they don't know how to make friends. Many of them, the more classically affected kids, don't appear to have any interest in people whatsoever. And then the third area is in repetitive behavior. It can be the very classical forms such as rocking or hand flapping, and it can be something less classical as being obsessed in a specific topic or needing your sheets to be the same every day.
If you had a new baby and he had us on TV all the time, the kid was like 4 months old and wasn't smiling and didn't make eye contact, does that mean the kid's autistic?
Not necessarily. I mean, the research now is really moving back the diagnosis, and so we're starting to identify a couple of characteristics that are pretty consistent with later on the diagnosis of autism. But the two that are most commonly cited are what we call poor affective social relationships, which means they aren't smiling, they aren't reciprocal, engaging in these reciprocal peekaboo interactions, and the other is they're not responding to their name. But usually you don't get too clear on whether or not this is autism until the kids are about 1 year of age.
So initially a kid at just that age is a little concerned, but doesn't mean the kid's going to end up that way.
No, I would be concerned, but only because the whole development of joint attention also plays such a significant role in language, that if you're starting, I would be concerned if at 5 or 6 months my child wasn't making eye contact or engaging in a reciprocal smile, but it doesn't mean that they have autism. It just means that you should keep an eye on the child, and if by 12, 13, 14 months they're not responding to their name consistently and they're still not engaging in reciprocal social interactions, then I would be concerned, and I would clearly take the child to be evaluated.
Of course, you would also make sure the kid is hearing and seeing because...
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, hearing is the first thing we would check.
Okay, we do check kids when they're born for hearing, but there are kids who hear normally when they're born, and now we'll find some that have lose their hearing later on.
That's right.
Okay, the other thing is if a kid is 18 months old and not saying any words, not trying to reach out to get the parents to do something, that's a big, big red flag you're concerned, aren't you?
Yeah, I mean, the speech part is interesting because there's a whole group of kids called late talkers, and there's a whole bunch of kids who don't develop speech within what we would call the normal time frame, who don't have autism. But the thing that distinguishes the two is that the children who aren't developing speech, who probably later on are diagnosed with autism, are the kids who aren't compensating. So if you see a child who's deaf at 18 months, they may not be speaking, but they're compensating by gesturing and by...
They're trying to get something from the
They're trying to communicate, whereas the children who later have a diagnosis of autism, you don't see any compensation. They're not trying to communicate in any way.
Getting back to that little baby, if you're a little concerned about development, and there are programs available, you certainly would have the kid evaluated by a neurologist or a developmental program.
I would. The most important thing at this point, though, is that there are very few people who are good enough at evaluating infants. So if I had a child who was under 18 months of age and I was concerned, I would make sure that I looked for a pediatric neurologist who had experience in diagnosing children on the spectrum.
Or there are pediatricians who are called developmental experts today that work with kids on that one area alone.
That's right. I would want to know that whoever I took my child to had a significant experience, because there is so much to gain by getting your child diagnosed early. But if you take your child to the person who doesn't have a lot of experience, they probably wouldn't give you the appropriate classification.
So in other words, if you've got the kid on some kind of an infant stimulation program, there's no guarantee this works, but there's no loss by trying to do different things to get the kids to reach out and develop different type of muscle and speech type of things. It can't hurt the kid, can it?
No, not at all. And the research is pretty clear that we now believe that we're actually affecting brain development, and so the idea is if you get these children younger and younger and younger, you've got more of an opportunity to affect positive brain change, and in some cases actually have the children develop such that they no longer have a diagnosis.
So what would be the earliest age that you would feel a kid would benefit from anything? Because a red flag to that diagnosis of autism, what would be the earliest age you see you'd work in that kind of...
I have never seen a child who's been diagnosed prior to about 14 months of age. But, you know, if I were worried, I would start doing a lot of stimulation in terms of trying to get the child to respond to me, trying as young as possible. But I doubt you'd see at this point any type of a formal diagnosis before 12 months of age, unless the child was really seriously involved.
In your school, what's the earliest age you would get a kid in any kind of your programs?
Well, we start our programs at age 3 because we don't do early intervention. But we work with early intervention programs, and they see the kids as young as 14 and 15 months of age.
And if you're going to choose an early intervention program, you really have to be careful too, don't you?
Oh, absolutely.
There are good and bad and ugly in anything this world.
Absolutely, especially in this day and age where everybody's doing applied behavior analysis, but that doesn't mean that everybody's doing it well. And you know, you have to keep up on the research, and the curriculum has to be modified when you're working with a 12-month-old. It can't be the same curriculum we use with an 18-month-old or a 24-month-old.
Usually a pediatrician will know the better programs or whatever takes care of your child.
Yeah, or I would contact the state autism associations. For example, you know, in Staten Island, there's the Grace Foundation. In New Jersey, there's the COSAC. Those would be the ones I would contact to really find out which is the best early intervention agencies.
Now, if you do get the kid at age 3 here, what does E2 do to help these kids so they're better off down the road?
Well, we offer an intensive behavioral program. We're not eclectic. We don't go in different directions. We really focus on behavior analysis. It's the one intervention that at this point has a proven track record, and we provide 6 hours a day of applied behavior analysis, and then we work with the families so that they carry these programs over at home.
If you could sort of like explain what that is so that we who don't know what it is would have a better understanding.
It's basically applied behavior analysis is taking the principles of learning and using those principles in terms of applying reinforcement to increase behaviors. But more importantly, for children on the autism spectrum, we take the pieces of skills that they need to acquire and we break them down. The two things we know about children with autism is that they don't process the world the way we do. So what they often do what's called stimulus over-selectivity, which means they over-select on something irrelevant. So they may be looking at your right ear as opposed to looking at your eyes.
Fixating on one particular
It's not so much fixating, it's that they aren't clear on what the important salient features of information are. And so you think, for example, if you're teaching them to identify a dog in a picture, that they're actually seeing the whole dog, but what they may be doing is labeling the color, the background color. And so then when they see a picture of a dog that has a different background color, they can't label it. In other words, they are over-selecting oftentimes on irrelevant information, and so that's why their learning is very challenged. And the other problem that we know is that they don't respond to the same social contingencies that typically developing kids do. So smiles and praise and those things in early on aren't very reinforcing. So what we do in a good behavioral program is we take these skills, we break them down into such small pieces that we know that they're attending to the most relevant salient pieces because there is no distraction. And we do a very careful assessment of what we know they like, and we use their likes, meaning their personal preferred reinforcers, and we add that to the mix of broken down information so that they can sort of get back into what we would call a more typical learning trajectory.
If you took a kid that was at risk and you put them through the program, do any of these kids ever graduate into a normal functioning class?
Yeah, we have several kids. You know, the data fluctuates from program to program. There's been data published as high as 35–40% of children. I think that's probably overstated. I would say that 10 to 15% of our children entering at age 3 will move on to what we would call general education, and then another 10 to 20% would move on to less restrictive special education.